We're opening up an analysis today that really deals with the very foundation of justice. It's the wrongful conviction of a man named Randall Dale Adams.
And this isn't just a story of mistaken identity. What we're looking at here is a clinical example of a systemic breakdown.
It all starts with a tragic 1976 shooting of a Dallas police officer, Robert W. Wood. And because of that crime, Randall Adams spent 12 years of his life incarcerated, much of that time on death row, for something he did not do.
It is absolutely crucial as we begin to go through the source material that we pause here. We have to recognize the profound and, well, irreversible loss suffered by Officer Wood, his family, and his partner, Teresa Turco.
Yes.
Officer Wood was murdered while serving his community. The legal failures that followed, the ones involving Adams, they were secondary injustice, but the initial human tragedy. That is the devastating context for everything else.
That context is vital. And our look at the sources today is meant to be rigorous. Our mission is to meticulously trace the exact unforgiving path that led to Adams's conviction.
We want to identify the specific legal and evidentiary failures, the ones that kept him in prison.
And to examine the truly unique external intervention that happened. A documentary film was ultimately what was required to prove his innocence and compel the legal system to finally reverse its course in 1989. We really want to understand the mechanics of how this failure happened.
The initial details just set such a chilling scene. Adams, who was born in 1948, was wrongly accused, tried, and then sentenced to death for Officer Wood's murder.
And he never wavered. He maintained his innocence throughout the entire ordeal.
He did, and while a crucial legal maneuver in 1980, the commutation of his death sentence, gave him some momentary relief from execution, the heavy burden of that conviction itself that continued for nearly another decade.
Okay, so let's unpack this chronology. The setup of Adams' life makes everything that happened next feel particularly random. So cool.
It really does.
Randall Dale Adams was born in Grove City, Ohio back in 1948. He was the youngest of 5 kids from a working-class background. His father was a miner who, tragically, died of black lung disease.
Right. And Adams, he graduated high school in 1967. Then he served 3 years, honorably, as a U.S. Army paratrooper. So this is a veteran we're talking about.
He's not some hardened criminal. He's a man traveling through the country.
He was, in essence, a man in transit. In October of 1976, Adams, he was 27 at the time, he and his brother left Ohio. Their plan was to head to California.
But they made a stopover in Dallas. They got there on Thanksgiving night.
And Adams, trying to make some money for the rest of the trip, he briefly pursued a job he'd heard about, a contracting position.
And this is where the entire narrative pivots. It's on the smallest, most common of failures, a mechanical failure.
It's unbelievable when you think about it.
On Saturday, November 27th, Adams drives out to this contracting job site, but it's closed. It was a weekend. So on his way back, his car runs out of fuel.
That's it. That's the moment.
That one, seemingly insignificant, frustrating moment, created the precise vulnerability that the prosecution later used to tie him to this horrific crime.
Yeah.
If his car hadn't stalled right there, right then.
He never would have met the actual culprit. It's a true butterfly effect in action. It leads him directly to a 16-year-old named David Ray Harris.
Just 16, a juvenile under Texas law.
Yes, and the source material is very clear about Harris's state at that moment. He was already deep into criminal activity. He was driving a car he'd stolen from his neighbor back in Vidor, Texas.
And not only that, he was armed.
Heavily armed. He was carrying 2 weapons, his father's pistol, which was a .22 short caliber revolver, and also a shotgun. This suggests he was either already engaged in, or at least prepared for, some serious criminal activity when he just happened to drive past Adams.
So Adams is stranded, and he accepts a ride from this teenager.
And the two of them end up spending the day together. We know from the trial testimony that followed that their day involved a lot of substance use.
Drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana.
Yes, and the timeline is specific, leading right up to the crime itself. They went to a drive-in movie theater.
We even know what movies they saw, because the prosecution used this to build their timeline.
We do. They watched The Student Body, a 1976 film, and The Swinging Cheerleaders from 1974. These, seemingly irrelevant details helped the prosecution construct this very concrete, but ultimately false timeline.
A timeline that placed Adams in the car with Harris right up until the moment Officer Wood was murdered.
Exactly. The crime itself took place just after midnight, so it's the early hours of Sunday, November 28th.
And Officer Robert W. Wood and his partner Teresa Turco, who the sources identify as one of the very first female patrol officers in Dallas, They were working that graveyard shift.
The traffic stop, it happened in the 3400 block of Northampton Road. And the reason for the stop was so minor.
The headlights were off on the stolen car.
That's all it was. A
Yeah.
routine, low-level violation that just instantly escalates into a capital murder.
As Officer Wood approached the driver's side of the car, someone inside shot him twice, once in the forearm and once in the chest.
And the vehicle immediately just sped off into the night.
Officer Turco, his partner, she fired her weapon at the fleeing car, but she wasn't able to hit it, wasn't able to stop them.
And Officer Wood was murdered, right there in the line of duty. A horrific crime. And you can imagine the Dallas Police Department was determined to solve it, and solve it quickly.
The immediate, chaotic escape. It meant the police had very little to go on at first, just a description of the car and a general location.
But the investigation, as we'll see, it quickly led them back to David Ray Harris, a young man who had a very dangerous inability to keep quiet about what he'd done.
And that's the thing. The initial police investigation was actually quite successful. It led them to the right person.
It did. It led them straight to David Ray Harris.
Harris goes back to his hometown of Vidor, Texas, and just shockingly, he starts boasting to his friends that he's the one responsible for shooting a Dallas police officer.
It's that bragging that gets him arrested, but this is where the devastating shift occurs. This is the moment the path to justice just veers completely into injustice.
When he's brought in for questioning, he sees a way out.
He does. Instead of confessing, he immediately shifts the entire blame onto Randall Dale Adams. Harris claims that Adams was the one driving, and that Adams was the one who pulled the trigger.
But critically, Harris does help the police.
Yeah.
He leads them to the abandoned stolen car and to the .22 short-caliber revolver.
Right, which was then identified as the murder weapon. So you see what he did. He provided the physical evidence, which gave him credibility, but he deflected all the criminal culpability onto Adams.
So wait a minute. If the police had Harris, the kid who was bragging about the crime, who also had direct access to the car and the weapon, why did the prosecutor, a man named Douglas T. Mulder, pivot to charging Adams, the adult? Why not just prosecute the person they initially suspected?
The sources make it abundantly clear that this was a calculated, strategic, legal maneuver.
A maneuver.
Yes. The core issue was the availability of the death penalty. Harris, as you said, was a juvenile. He'd just turned 16. Under Texas law at the time, he could not face capital punishment.
But Adams, at 27, was an adult.
And therefore eligible for the death penalty.
So the prosecution's primary goal, it seems, was securing the ultimate penalty, the most severe one possible. It wasn't about simply prosecuting the person who was most likely the murderer.
That's the logical conclusion. The charging decision was driven by the desired punishment, not by the strength of the evidence or the objective pursuit of truth. And this strategic move, it fundamentally tainted the entire judicial process from the very beginning.
So what went to trial was this classic, high-stakes, he said case.
Exactly. And it's complicated by this highly biased charging decision. Adams testified, and he offered an alibi that was supported by his brother. He claimed Harris dropped him off at his motel after the movies, and he was just watching TV when the shooting happened.
And Harris, on the other hand, had testified that Adams was absolutely in the car, was driving at the time of the stop, and was the one who fired the fatal shots.
So for the jury, it came down to deciding whose story was more believable. The juvenile claiming to be an innocent bystander, or the adult claiming to have an alibi.
And the prosecution used all its power to make the juvenile Harris appear to be the credible witness.
And to do that, to support Harris's very shaky testimony, the prosecution relied on several other witnesses. Witnesses the source material flags as, quote, questionable.
This included Emily Miller and R.L. Miller, a couple who claimed they had driven past Harris's car just moments before the shooting.
And their testimony corroborated the prosecution's narrative. It specifically placed Adams at the scene and confirmed certain details of the traffic stop.
The inclusion of these eyewitness accounts, however flimsy they turned out to be, was absolutely crucial for the state's case. But maybe the most damning and certainly the most controversial part of the trial was the introduction of psychiatric testimony.
From Dr. James Grigson.
Dr. Death.
Yes, he later became known infamously as Dr. Death. He was a Texas forensic psychiatrist, and he was frequently employed by prosecutors in capital cases, after what was described as a cursory psychiatric evaluation of Adams.
Which Adams himself contended was completely insufficient.
Yes. After that evaluation, Grigson testified for the prosecution.
And what was the specific impact of what he said?
Grigson told the jury, without any reservation, that Adams would be an ongoing menace if kept alive.
An ongoing menace.
That testimony spoke directly to the element of future dangerousness, which was, and still is, a critical consideration under Texas capital sentencing law. This expert opinion essentially guaranteed the jury that if they spared Randall Adams, he would inevitably kill again.
It transforms him from a potentially mistaken suspect into a clear, immediate, perpetual threat to society.
It was incredibly persuasive, and it was the critical factor in securing that death penalty conviction.
The jury came back with a guilty verdict, and Adams was sentenced to death. The conviction was upheld unanimously by the Texas Courts of Appeals in 1979.
But the story of Dr. Grigson, the man who provided that crucial expert opinion that sealed Adams' fate, it's a story that really underscores the corruption of that evidence.
It's vital context, isn't it?
It is. We have to note that years later, in 1995, Dr. Grigson was expelled, not just from the American Psychiatric Association, but also from the Texas Society of Psychiatric Physicians.
And the reason for his expulsion?
Unethical conduct, specifically related to his expert witness testimony in capital cases just like Randall Dale Adams's.
And this detail connects directly to the broader implication here. It shows how the system's reliance on a single, aggressive, and later professionally discredited expert, an expert used specifically to satisfy a legal requirement for the death penalty, can fundamentally corrupt the entire path to truth.
The whole conviction rested on unreliable evidence and questionable professional practices. And they were prioritized because they served the state's desire for the harshest possible punishment.
And to be clear, what did the American Psychiatric Association find he did that was so unethical?
They found that Grigson repeatedly violated professional ethics. He was making these definitive predictions about the long-term future dangerousness of defendants after only minimal, or sometimes no, direct examination.
Which is precisely what he did to Adams.
Precisely. This reliance on certainty, where at best only probability exists, is what made his role in these cases so toxic. And in this case, it ensured Randall Adams was condemned to die.
Adams's initial date with the execution chamber was set for May 8, 1979. He was, just days away from being executed?
Just days. He received a stay of execution from U.S. Supreme Court Justice Lewis F. Powell, Jr. That stay was granted just 3 days before his scheduled death.
So that's a moment of, I guess, technical relief. It prevents the immediate execution, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem of the conviction.
Not at all. The next major intervention came in 1980, and it was systemic. It dealt with a larger constitutional flaw in the procedure used in Texas. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled 8-1 on a procedural issue that had to do with jury oaths.
Okay, so what exactly did the Supreme Court find unconstitutional about this oath that jurors in Texas capital cases had to swear?
Well, the challenge was that Texas required jurors to swear a mandatory oath that might have improperly influenced how they considered certain factual matters, either about guilt or innocence, or more specifically about how they determined the punishment.
So it sort of boxed them in.
In a way, yes. The Supreme Court found that requiring jurors to swear they would set aside their personal beliefs about the death penalty and rely only on the evidence presented in a very specific, restrictive way that violated due process.
And that decision was crucial because it directly impacted Adams's original conviction.
It did. The ruling reversed Adams's death sentence and it granted him a new trial, so the immediate threat of execution was, for the moment, gone.
However, he was still, in the eyes of the law, a convicted murderer.
Very much so. And before that mandated new trial could even get started, another political move occurred. The Texas governor at the time, Bill Clements, commuted Adams's sentence to life imprisonment.
And this was done at the request of the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. Okay, so why would the DA's office request a commutation to life if the Supreme Court had already granted him a whole new trial? What was the strategy there?
That is a key piece of legal strategy. A new trial would have forced the prosecution to represent all of its evidence,
Including the now contested eyewitness testimony.
and the controversial Dr. Grigson, who was already starting to attract significant criticism for his methods. By commuting the sentence to life, Adams was safely off death row, which relieved a lot of political pressure, but he remained convicted.
So the state avoided the risk and the expense of a potentially embarrassing retrial where all their methods and their evidence might be exposed to the light of day.
Exactly. Adams was safe from execution, but he was trapped in this terrible legal limbo, still doing hard time for a crime he didn't commit.
His freedom would end up coming from a completely different direction. He became the subject of a 1988 documentary film called The Thin Blue Line, directed by Errol Morris.
And this isn't just some fascinating side note. This film is the central mechanism by which the facts of this case were finally brought to light. It's an extraordinary example of how dedicated, external, journalistic scrutiny can reveal defects that the system itself just refuses to correct.
Morris's methodology was, by all accounts, relentless.
It was. The film didn't just re-interview Adams. Morris went way beyond the scope of a standard legal defense investigation. He had already learned that David Ray Harris, the real killer, had this habit of bragging about shooting a police officer on multiple occasions.
So Morris focused on the contradictions, the discrepancies that had been completely ignored during the original trial.
He essentially reconstructed the entire night of the murder, and in doing so, he revealed a narrative that was fundamentally different from the one that the courts had accepted as fact.
And his investigation didn't just focus on disproving Autumn's guilt. It uncovered concrete, compelling evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and exposed the severe issues with the eyewitnesses.
It did, and the film's investigation really culminated in an on-camera interview with David Ray Harris himself.
This is in May of 1988.
Yes, and by this point, Harris was incarcerated on death row for a completely unrelated crime, the 1985 murder of a man named Mark Mays. And during this interview with Morris, he made a shocking admission.
He confessed?
He did. He stated that Randall Dale Adams was not even in the car on the night that Officer Wood was murdered. That admission, secured by Morris's persistent investigation and his commitment to the truth, it just completely dismantled the foundation of the original conviction.
It's incredible. It took a filmmaker 8 years after the Supreme Court had already intervened to get the truth out of the actual perpetrator.
The film was released in August of 1988, and it generated massive public awareness. It put undeniable pressure on the Texas legal establishment to finally address all this new evidence of misconduct.
And that pressure worked. 6 months after The Thin Blue Line was released, after Harris's confession became widely known, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals officially overturned Adams' conviction.
This was in 1989, in a ruling known as Ex parte Adams. And this was not a soft finding. It was a severe condemnation of the Dallas County prosecution.
Okay, we absolutely have to spend time detailing the grounds for this reversal because this is the core of the injustice. It all centered on what the courts identified as malfeasance by the prosecutor, Douglas D. Mulder.
And clear inconsistencies in the testimony of that key prosecution witness, Emily Miller. This was far beyond simple error. This was the active concealment of facts that were vital to Adams's defense.
We can break down Mulder's misconduct into, 3 distinct professionally damning acts?
Yes, and it essentially constitutes what's known as a Brady violation, the withholding of exculpatory evidence. First, Mulder withheld a prior statement that Emily Miller had given to the police.
And this prior statement was contradictory to what she said at trial.
It was. It clearly cast doubt on her credibility and on her ability to even identify Adams in the first place.
Let's elaborate on that for a second. When a prosecutor withholds information that tends to show the defendant is innocent, or even information that could just make a key witness look unreliable, they are denying the defendant due process. So what specifically was in Emily Miller's prior statement that was so damaging to the prosecution's case?
Well, the source material indicates that her prior statement revealed she couldn't definitively identify who was in the car. She wasn't even sure if there were 2 men in the car or the number of people.
So it completely weakened her ability to place Adams at the scene.
And to corroborate Harris's story that Adams was the shooter. By withholding it, Mulder prevented Adams's defense team from being able to cross-examine her effectively. He allowed her highly questionable testimony to stand unchallenged, which is exactly what a prosecutor must not do.
Okay, so that's the first thing. The second, the source material explicitly states that Mulder allowed Miller to give perjured testimony.
Yes.
And that is a critical distinction, isn't it? It's one thing to present flawed evidence. It's another thing entirely to knowingly allow a witness to lie under oath.
Especially in a trial where a man's life is hanging in the balance. This action strikes right at the heart of the system's integrity. Allowing perjury fundamentally warps the entire legal process.
Mulder knew her earlier statement contradicted what she was saying in court.
Which means he was aware she was potentially misleading the jury, yet he just allowed the testimony to proceed because it aligned with the state's goal, securing that death sentence.
And the third act of misconduct. It happened late in the trial. Adams' defense attorney eventually managed to discover that this prior statement even existed.
Right. And when the defense sought to recall Emily Miller to the stand to confront her with the contradiction, which is a fundamental right of the defense, Mulder falsely told the court that he did not know her whereabouts.
He just lied to the court.
He did. This specific lie prevented the defense from completing that crucial cross-examination. He deliberately misled the judge and the court to protect the false narrative he had constructed.
And the appeals court, what did they say about this?
The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, in their ruling overturning the conviction, they minced absolutely no words. They stated that the conviction was unfair mainly because of prosecutor Doug Mulder. His actions were the central reason an innocent man was sentenced to death.
So after the conviction is overturned, the case is sent back to Dallas County for a retrial.
But the district attorney's office, they ultimately declined to prosecute Adams again. Given the elapsed time since the original crime and the severe, now documented malfeasance of their own former prosecutor, they decided the case just couldn't be successfully pursued.
So with the prosecution declining to move forward, the charges against Adams were dismissed.
And he walked free in March of 1989. After 12 years of wrongful incarceration, including time spent living under the constant threat of execution, his freedom was finally secured. But the story of injustice, it did not end with his release.
No. We now have to turn to the profound injustice of his compensation.
This is, for me, perhaps the most egregious part of the whole aftermath. Randall Dale Adams was wrongly imprisoned for 12 years, yet he received zero compensation. Nothing from the state of Texas for the time, the trauma, the life that he lost.
Why? How is that possible?
The reason is in the Texas law as it existed back in 1989. At the time of his release, any compensation offered by the state, which was a maximum lump sum of just $25,000, was only available if the wrongly convicted prisoner was formally pardoned by the governor.
But Adams's case was dismissed. He wasn't pardoned.
Exactly. Since his case was dismissed following the appeals court ruling, rather than resulting in a gubernatorial pardon, he didn't meet the very restrictive criteria. He received no payment from the state that stole 12 years of his life.
The contrast to today is just staggering and highlights how inadequate the law was at that time.
It's a world of difference. If Adams were released under current Texas law, he would be entitled to $80,000 for each year he was incarcerated.
So 12 years. That's nearly $1 million.
It is. That difference underscores just how completely unprotected the wrongfully convicted were when Adams finally got his freedom. It raises a very serious question about the state's responsibility to repair the damage it inflicts.
And we also have to address the fate of David Ray Harris.
Yes. Although he recanted his testimony at Adams's habeas corpus hearing, claiming Adams wasn't in the car, the sources confirm he never judicially admitted his own guilt for Officer Wood's murder.
And crucially, he was never formally charged for that crime.
Never. Which means that the murder of Officer Wood, the initiating tragedy of this entire case, it remained officially unsolved and unprosecuted against the true culprit.
Harris did, however, face justice for other crimes.
He did. On June 30th, 2004, David Ray Harris was executed by lethal injection for the unrelated 1985 murder of a man named Mark Mays in Beaumont, Texas. That murder occurred during an attempted abduction of Mays' girlfriend.
So while Harris ultimately paid the ultimate penalty for a different crime, the state's failure to bring him to justice for Officer Wood's murder and its decision to wrongfully prosecute Adams instead, that remains a permanent, painful stain on the history of the Dallas County justice system. So Adams is finally free. But the legal and emotional turmoil, it just did not end with his release. Almost immediately, he gets embroiled in a legal dispute with Errol Morris.
The man whose work, The Thin Blue Line, had been the very catalyst for his exoneration. The conflict was all centered on the commercial rights to Adams's life story.
The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, and Adams, he successfully secured the sole use of anything written or made on the subject of his life.
Adams was very clear about his motivation for filing that suit. He stated, and this is a quote, that he did not sue Errol Morris for any money or any percentages of The Thin Blue Line. He said the dispute was focused entirely on the exclusive rights claim that Morris felt he had over Adams's personal history.
Morris, the filmmaker, he offered a really reflective and complex perspective on this whole dispute. He acknowledged the immense difficulty Adams faced just returning to a normal life after his ordeal.
He recalled Adams becoming, quote, very angry at the fact that he had signed a release giving me rights to his life story, and he felt as though I had stolen something from him.
And that really speaks to the profound psychological impact of long-term wrongful incarceration, doesn't it?
It has to. That trauma doesn't just disappear when the prison doors open. For Adams, having the state steal 12 years of his life and then having an external party claiming exclusive ownership over the story of that stolen life, it must have felt like a continuation of that same powerlessness.
And Morris, to his credit, seemed to understand that.
He demonstrated, I think, a commendable insight by acknowledging that he couldn't truly understand what it's like to be imprisoned for that long for a crime you didn't commit.
Despite these conflicts, Adams took this painful experience and he immediately turned it into advocacy.
While he was incarcerated, he had pursued his education. He earned a correspondence course degree from Lee College in Baytown, Texas. And upon his release, he became a very outspoken anti-death penalty activist, committed to ensuring that no one else would suffer the same fate.
He also authored a book, Adams v. Texas, which was published in 1992. It chronicled his experiences and exposed all these systemic failings.
His voice became absolutely indispensable in the national discussion around capital punishment and judicial error. He had an undeniable moral authority.
He really did. In 2001, at a legislative hearing on behalf of the Texas Moratorium Network, Adams delivered this incredibly powerful statement that just summarized the sheer scope of the injustice he suffered.
Can we read that?
Yes, he said, "The man you see before you is here by the grace of God. The fact that it took 12 and a half years in a movie to prove my innocence should scare the hell out of everyone in this room, and if it doesn't, then that scares the hell out of me."
Wow. That sentiment just encapsulates the catastrophic systemic failure. It required an independent, non-governmental investigation, an artistic and journalistic pursuit to compel the courts to finally confront the prosecutorial misconduct that had been allowed to operate.
And that misconduct cost an innocent man years of his life and placed him repeatedly on the verge of execution.
We also see the influence of his activism and his experience in his personal life. In 1999, Adams married a woman named Jill Fratta, whose brother was incarcerated on death row.
So he connected his personal commitment to reform directly to his deepest relationships.
It seems so. And his later life, thankfully, did offer him some measure of peace. According to his lawyer, Randy Schaefer, Randall Dale Adams died quietly on October 30th, 2010. He was 61 years old.
He passed away from a brain tumor in Washington Courthouse, Ohio.
Yes, and Schaefer noted that Adams had successfully managed to live a quiet life, one that was divorced from his infamous past, though his legacy as an exoneree fundamentally changed the landscape of the death penalty debate.
When we examine this entire body of source material, the case of Randall Dale Adams really reveals a perfect storm of systemic failures.
It does. And the primary failure was that fatal prosecutorial decision to prioritize securing a death sentence for the adult, Adams, over prosecuting the confirmed juvenile suspect, David Ray Harris.
Justice was superseded by the pursuit of the harshest possible punishment.
Second, you have the deliberate corruption and concealment of evidence that sustained the wrongful conviction. We saw the fragility of eyewitness testimony, the reliance on an ethically compromised expert like Dr. Death.
And most damningly, the prosecutor's active and malicious withholding of exculpatory evidence and then lying directly to the court.
These were not mistakes. They were intentional acts that just undermined due process completely.
And third, there's the terrifying powerlessness of the system to correct itself. The initial conviction was upheld repeatedly. It took a massive, public, persistent external intervention.
Errol Morris's film.
To compel the legal system to finally acknowledge the truth and address the severe malfeasance. The system required a shock to the public conscience just to function correctly.
And the broader implication here, I think, is the absolute necessity of critical analysis, of questioning what is presented as truth in a courtroom, particularly when the stakes are life and death.
Adams's story is just a vivid, painful demonstration of the devastating human cost of a wrongful conviction. A cost that extends far beyond the prison walls, even after that conviction is finally reversed.
So what does this entire exploration mean for you, the listener? Well, given the profound fact that Randall Dale Adams was never compensated, not a single cent for those 12 years of wrongful imprisonment, a time where he lived daily with the shadow of execution.
We have to consider the ethical, the moral, and the financial role the state has in restoring dignity and security to the lives it has irreversibly damaged through its own systemic error. What is the true measure of justice when a life is stolen and the government is the one responsible for the theft?
That question of state accountability for lost time, it remains the most difficult, unanswered piece of Randall Dale Adams' legacy.
Thanks for listening.